Hello, this presentation is about Middle America, which is the region of northern North America, also part of Latin America. Primarily we'll be talking about Central American countries and the Caribbean islands. The region of Middle America has a variety of geographic contrast. It is both high and mountainous, as well as has much of it is tropical rainforest, both in the island areas as well as along the mainland. This particular slide talks about the geographic differences across all of Latin America. As I'll talk about in another presentation, in terms of South America, the Andes Mountains, for example, are the second highest mountains in the world, as well as some of the driest parts of the world exist high in those mountains. But in this part of Latin America, what is also called Middle America, much of it is coastal, much of it is tropical and densely forested. But there are areas of high mountain ranges right along the coast. Something to consider is that when you look at North America and consider the mountain range that runs in Alaska along the coastline of Canada, also runs the Cascades, which run through parts of California, Oregon, Washington State. That same mountain range continues all the way down into Central America and eventually meets up with the Andes Mountains. So this is a map of the physical geographic map of the Middle American region. As you can see, Mexico is clearly the largest country in this region, followed closely by countries like Cuba and Guatemala, Nicaragua. And you can see here where the mountain ranges run through the central part of Mexico and continue down through Guatemala and Honduras. And even though the mountains in Central America are not as steep or pronounced as they are up along the California coastline, or certainly in the Andes Mountains, in the area they do create some challenging terrain, particularly when we start talking about infrastructure or economic development. It becomes very difficult in interior parts of this part of the world to develop the infrastructure for further economic development, which has created challenges for the area. This gives you a little bit about population distribution across the area. Mexico City, which is in this area right here, is one of the largest cities not only in the region but also in the world. Cities like Guatemala City, Managua, San Salvador, Havana, Port-au-Prince, which is the capital of Haiti, Havana, capital of Cuba. You can see here that there are several densely populated urban areas. In fact, the region is very much urbanized, though much of the economy is driven by agriculture, by the agricultural industry. So as I've already mentioned, the natural environment is primarily tropical, all the way down to the southern hemisphere. This kind of gives you an idea about some of the variations in terrain. In the lower lining areas of this part of the world, you find tropical plant production, particularly banana groves, sugar plantations. Also rice is produced, although mostly rice is produced in South America, but along the lower mountain ranges, you find production of coffee, wheat, corn. The weather, because it never really snows in this part of the world, Middle America, it is ideal for year-round growing. of certain crops. In the higher elevations is where you start to find more temperate types of climate, and therefore the production of things like wheat and potatoes, though because of its mountainous terrain, large-scale farming like we see in the United States just isn't possible. Most of this is subsistence farming or farming in small batches or small localized production. What ultimately ends up happening, particularly in, say, coffee production, is you have multiple growers who work in cooperatives. In other words, they gather their collective crops and they sell it in bulk or as a group to a middleman or to a distributor. So, regional cultural history. The region was dominated for centuries by what's termed pre-Columbian civilizations. The two most well-known in the Middle American region are the Maya and the Aztecs, although there's also the Toltecs, among others. These particular civilizations were quite advanced. They did operate like city-states, so in other words, similar to the way the Greeks and the Romans distributed their power around different central or kind of regional hubs. The civilizations here were very adept at scientific notation, geography in terms of local geography, understanding the topography, very knowledgeable about astronomy, architecture, and thus by the time West came starting in the early parts of the 60s, these civilizations were about as advanced as Greeks or even late Egyptian, in terms of their knowledge and understanding about certain aspects of technology. The challenge with confronting the Spanish for these relatively advanced civilizations was simply the Spanish, like every other European power, had access to guns, large ships, and other technologies that had been developed primarily during the Middle Ages through contact with places like China, utilizing those particularly military technologies to conquer most of the Western Hemisphere and large parts of Africa. In addition to the technology, the other thing that struck these particular advanced pre-Columbian civilizations hard was the contact of various diseases, things like smallpox, which the Europeans, after dealing with centuries of disease throughout the Middle Ages, famously the Black Plague, these diseases were not known in the Western Hemisphere, and thus huge chunks of the population experience, in effect, their own kind of plague, their own kind of pandemic, which killed off big sections of the population within a rapid period of time. You're looking at, in some places, as much as 80% of the population being lost to the exposure to these diseases. This is a map of the kind of the distribution of. It says Aboriginal economies. Essentially, what we're talking is pre-Columbian is a term that's often used, or Mesoamerican cultures. The Incan, which I'll talk more about when we talk about Latin America, is primarily here in Peru, Bolivia, along the coastline here. The Maya occupied this kind of region called the Yucatan Peninsula, southern Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras region. And then the Aztecs and Toltecs were in central Mexico, roughly where Mexico City is today. In terms of other populations, the civilizations varied widely across all of the Western Hemisphere. Civilization started, or man's settlement of the Western Hemisphere started as far back as, one of the Middle Ice Ages, so that's 100,000 years ago. But once they settled in this area, they lived in relative isolation from the eastern half of the world until Spanish conquests. That's not to say that there wasn't other civilizations that came to visit the Western Hemisphere. We know that the Vikings made contact in places in Canada and New England. It's believed that the Chinese may have made contact during the Middle Ages along Latin America and Central American coastlines. And it's also believed that Polynesians may have made it all the way to this coastline. But aside from these kind of isolated contacts, actual continual engagement with native Western Hemisphere populations was limited. The populations, as I said, there's the sort of larger Mesoamerican, almost like empires that existed in Mexico and along the west coast of South America. Throughout, you find other native populations that are less advanced or less developed. These different varying layers of population and levels of technological advancement really are reflective of the the physical geographic environment that each of these civilizations exist. So, for example, where you find Aztecs and you find Inca, you find areas that are coastal, areas that are not as densely jungled like you do in the Amazonian regions, which is why tribal groups in here were less advanced, only because they were more nomadic and trying to develop large-scale cities in that dense jungle canopy was more challenging. What you do find with these nomadic populations is a movement of populations coming from North America all the way down through Central America into Latin America, and eventually populations coming back up north. The settlement of the Caribbean islands, is the native population through there is primarily from populations that built boats and crossed from Venezuela in Trinidad into these Lesser Antilles and Greater Antilles islands. That kind of population development on the islands occurred over a few thousand years, and actually not as long ago as one might think. Here's a map of colonialization as it occurred after Spanish and Portuguese conquest. Initially, the Spanish, famously Columbus, lands here at the island of Hispaniola, the only island in the Caribbean that has two countries on it. After that, you have other Spanish explorers, also known as conquistadors, which are basically just conquerors. They are military officers who primarily were working almost like mercenaries for the Spanish crown, here to take as much riches and material wealth from the local populations as they could back to Spain. Same thing is true with the Portuguese. The Pope famously divides the region in half between Spanish interests and Portuguese interests, although over time, because of the distance and because of the great wealth that is discovered in this part of the world, there becomes other groups that vie for interests in the region, particularly the British and the Dutch, who at this point are Protestant countries in conflict with Catholic countries, i.e. the Portuguese, the French, and the Spanish, start to take whole territories away from from the Spanish, creating their own colonies, usually usually along the coastline. And eventually, what happens certainly by the 17th century, is the Spanish crown has become so weakened by internal conflict, external conflicts in Europe, that as well as overexpansion, that they lose much of their territory in the Western Hemisphere. And by the early 1800s, not too long after the American Revolution, there is a series of revolutions throughout Latin America that lead to local Spanish descendant dictators or generals assuming control over their territory and creating their own countries separate from Spain. This provides a little bit more explanation about the distribution of different ethnic groups throughout the region. Most of the mainland areas were consolidated around native populations, and coastal areas around European descent populations. Plantations are the dominant economic structure for the 16th, 17th, 18th, and even into the 19th century. Coffee plantations, sugar plantations are most well known. Tobacco, cash crops. As I mentioned, the Spanish originally come here to sort of raid native populations of their precious their material wealth. But eventually, what they realize, everybody realizes, is that this becomes a rich farming region for Europe. We think about Europe and how northern it is. There are growing periods, and there's periods when the weather's too cold to raise anything, as well as the fact that Europeans are realizing that there's things that they enjoy, like sugar, for example, which seems like a minor commodity today. Sugar production can't occur in Europe; it's too cold. It can occur in these colonized areas, because that's essentially what we're talking about in the Western Hemisphere, is the colonization of much of this territory by Europeans, taking over somebody else's territory for the benefit of the economic gain of a European nation. So there's things that can be grown in this part of the world that can't be grown in Europe that Europeans enjoy. Sugar is not just used as a sweetener. It was a primary additive. It was also used to produce rum. That was actually its principal use, was to produce rum. So it becomes a very important lifeline to Europe. And it's the closest tropical lifeline to Europe, with the exception of Africa. It provides almost a way of developing plantation or cash crop based agricultural industries without having to compete with the Asian powers, and so that becomes a very important aspect of why this particular region develops so quickly, economically in particular. So over time, this region while this region started out to being quite economically diverse, it began to stumble. Part of the problem is, as I said, the economy in this area was dominated by agriculture. It was dominated by colonization, and the liberation of this part of the world occurred not by a kind of group effort. It was really local leadership taking power back from Europeans. And so, unlike the American Revolution, which is arguably is a kind of populist movement. In this part of the world, what we find is, with the exception of places like Jamaica and Haiti, for example, which have more of a kind of populist uprising that leads to liberation or leads to independence. In other places, it's more of a leadership taking control away from European powers, and so the power structure doesn't really change for lower income individuals, slaves, and so forth. It's really on a higher level where that occurs. The other thing that happens is this particular region, because it's so successful in terms of agricultural production, not unlike the southeastern United States, it's some of the last areas of the world to become industrialized. They rely so much on agriculture that they never engage in economic development or infrastructure development like we find in Europe or in the northern parts of the United States in the 19th century. So this region, thrives still today on agricultural production, and as a result, their gross domestic product is quite low. People in this region are quite poor. Mexico becomes the exception to the region only because of its oil fields and offshore oil fields in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as on the certain areas along the northern part of the Pacific coast. This chart gives you a little bit of a kind of detailed breakdown. You'll find this in your book, detailed breakdown about the different populations of Latin American countries, along with their gross domestic product and their per capita, how much people on average per capita are making. And you can see a wide variety of representation here. This kind of gives you a sense of how tiered the per capita income is across the region. Haiti is the poorest region, poorest country in this region. Up here on the higher end, these particular countries are lower population, as well as in the case of places like St. Kitts and Nevis, this is Caribbean islands. That's what these represent as well. Caribbean islands that thrive on tourism and offshore banking ventures. So Middle American region can be sort of subdivided into sort of three classifications: Caribbean islands, Mexico, and then the southern Central American countries. As I mentioned to you, with Mexico, their GDP and per capita income is higher than most other countries in the region, primarily because of these oil interests in the Gulf of Mexico. There's also some oil interests over here along the Gulf of California. Mexico is the third largest oil producer, I guess now the fourth largest oil producer in the Western Hemisphere. Fourth largest because Canada has become, a larger producer in recent years. But the three primary oil producers for decades were, of course, the United States, then Venezuela, and then Mexico. You can see that Mexico also has quite a bit of, because of the mountain ranges, has quite a bit of hard metals that they have access to. You'll see similar kinds of access to minerals and metals in places in the region lack these central minerals for extraction and, of course, selling on the open market. So again, this kind of adds to some of the material wealth of Mexico. The thing about Mexico that we often think of, or so often North Americans think of, is that Mexico is, a very poor nation with a lot of people leaving to come to the United States for work, both legally and illegally. In fact, as of over the last 5 to 10 years, the rate of illegal immigration from Mexico into the United States has dropped dramatically. In fact, there's almost a zero-sum game. The same number of people that are coming into the country are leaving the country from Mexico. We still have a strong, connection to Latin America here in the United States. You see it, certainly across, neighborhoods in Oklahoma City, but other major cities around the United States. But a lot of that development in Latin American population is actually coming from Central America, places like Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Salvador, not necessarily from Mexico. This kind of gives you an idea about the economic distribution of Mexico. There is a lot of manufacturing occurring in these border towns between the United States and Mexico, and so as a result, you find a lot of higher economic growth in these areas, in contrast to the tropical regions. This area down here becomes less developed. This is also where the majority of the population is native. Here it's kind of a mixed population. These areas in here are primarily rich because of their proximity to vacationing areas as well as the oil and gas development. The manufacturing here is a development that's occurred over the last, really pretty much the last 30 years. You find with the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, a rise in the United States, the rise in the sort of a expansion of the U.S.'s partnership with Mexico and Canada. Canada has always been the U.S.'s largest trading partner. Right along the U.S. border. There's only about 30 versus 350 million people living in the United States. In Mexico, there's about 150 million people living there. So again, Mexico is also a smaller country than the United States. In the case of Canada, it's all about natural resources, filtering them into the U.S. economy. In the case of Mexico, not so much about natural resources filtering the U.S. economy as it is about accessing cheap labor and utilizing that in the same way that we utilize cheap labor from China to produce goods. With Mexico having such close proximity, the introduction of NAFTA in the 1990s created an opportunity for companies to cross the border and use unskilled or semi-skilled labor to do easy manufacturing positions. While most of the skilled manufacturing is still here in the United States, less skilled manufacturing has helped drive the Mexican economy, which is some of the reason why you have less immigration into the United States. Most of the immigration in the United States is occurring from people coming in from these lower parts of Mexico, just like people from Central America moving up. And it's also people who have less education and less economic opportunities locally. Those in here have manufacturing opportunities, and those who have college educations or certainly graduated from high school tend to have more economic opportunities and therefore don't try to make their way into the United States. Of course, in the last few years, there's been a lot of discussion about the drug wars in Mexico. They, for the most part, have been regional, largely regional, confrontations between rival gangs and as well as the Mexican government getting involved in trying to quell these drug rings. the efforts of the Mexican government has really been been led by pressure by the United States to try to limit the amount of drug imports, illegal drug imports into the United States. The U.S. has struggled to deal with the issues at the borders. Most of these drug cartels that are sort of highlighted here have sophisticated distribution networks. They have very elaborate ways that they bring drugs into the United States. For example, in the case of the Tijuana cartel, they built, a 50-mile long tunnel that started in Tijuana, went all the way underneath the border, and actually came up into San Diego, several miles away, with a rail line that ran through there. And so it has been a problem. It continues to be a problem, although some of it, the actual drug deaths have dropped off recently. You still have this kind of regional fighting that has created, or in some cases destabilized, the central government of Mexico, as well as killed one of the principal, or hindered, not killed, but hindered one of the principal economic sources of income for Mexico, which is tourism. Mexico, like I'll talk about when we talk about Europe, I talk about how the Mediterranean countries in Europe rely heavily on tourism because of all their beachfront property that they have available. Same thing is the case with Mexico. So much of Mexico is coastal, as you can see, and so they rely on tourism all across the region to drive some of the local economy. This is a small map of all the countries along Central America. Each one has its own distinct qualities as well as problems. For the most part, during the 1980s, these countries in here, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala, experienced various civil wars or civil unrest. They have been ruled by dictators, as I mentioned to you, for centuries, as well as local populations that have been disgruntled over those issues. As a result, you have the some places like Nicaragua, you have an overthrow of the government. In places like Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, the central government was able to hold on, primarily because one of the other main factors in unrest here, particularly during the 70s and the 80s, was expansion of communist interests into Latin America. The communists sort of are well known to have financed the overthrow of the Cuban government, also to look to try to overthrow these countries here. And as I said, we're successful in Nicaragua, but not in the other three countries. Belize seems to have always stayed out of these conflicts. Costa Rica as well. In the case of Costa Rica, the thing to understand is that the native population in Costa Rica is actually quite low for various reasons. Primarily, the population has either been intermixed or they had such a changeover over the centuries of different other different ethnic groups coming in that Costa Rica is kind of an enigma. Today, Costa Rica has turned all of, or 80% of its land into a national park, and so they thrive primarily on tourism, which is where some of these other countries here, which are primarily agrarian, not agricultural, struggle. Panama is a little different because of the building of the Panama Canal. The United States built it. The Panama Canal, which basically was incredibly revolutionary economically for the world. It basically creates a shortcut from the Atlantic to the Pacific so that ships don't have to either unload their product and put it on trains and then carry it across the country, put it on another ship, and then send it off, either to Europe or to Asia. Instead, actual ships can simply keep their cargo on board, and you can simply go through the Panama Canal. There's one other canal in the world, the Suez Canal, which is up in Africa, which also created huge shortcuts. For centuries, the Spanish, Portuguese in particular, the French, and the Dutch would have to sail ships all the way around the entire distance of South America or Africa to bring luxury items from Asia back to Europe. So the Panama Canal creates that shortcut. There is talk currently about building a second canal here in Nicaragua that would start along this basically cut this little edge of the Pacific coast into Lake Nicaragua, and then they would canal this river, the San Juan River, out to the Caribbean Ocean. It would be a longer route, but it would create another route through the region. I've kind of already talked about the physiology of this. Where the major urban areas are. This kind of Panama Canal works. They've recently expanded the Panama Canal. The original Panama Canal, would only allow a certain size ship. The new one doubles the size of not only the ships, but the number of ships that can go through. Panama City has become a huge regional economic hub because of the Panama Canal. It's more of a multicultural international city than some of the other cities in the region, which are more indigenous or distinctive to that particular country or local economy. As you can see, there's efforts among Caribbean countries to try to create more economic development. Caribbean countries historically are primarily driven by tourism, but because there aren't a lot of natural resources or the availability to develop, their economy in diverse ways, such as you find on mainland countries or places like the United States. Caribbean countries moving beyond tourism have started to look at things like banking, for example, and trying to create liberal banking regulations which become very attractive to people who want to circumvent their own country's banking laws and regulations, such as the United States. One of the most well-known in the Caribbean is the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Island banking system allows people to store money there with numeric banking account numbers that are not tied to names, the way that Switzerland sort of has famously developed its banking system. And so as a result, people can store money there without having the United States trace that money or understand who owns it. Cuba is an enigma because it is the largest island in the Caribbean. Up until very recently, Cuba was an adversary of the United States. It originally, at one point, was a colony, and then it was a major ally up until the 1960s. It was common for people to go vacation in Cuba the way that people go to the Bahamas or to Cancun or different parts of Mexico. Cuba is really the original kind of tourist destination, and it will be again. But the economy has stalled there because of embargoes from the United States. Cuba has not had as many economic opportunities as places like Mexico and other parts of the Caribbean because of that tense relationship between the United States. Cuba is also the second closest country to the U.S., or I guess I should say third closest country to the U.S. after Mexico and Canada. Florida is just right here. And likely what will happen in the not too distant future is there will be ferries that travel back and forth between Key West and Havana, which there used to be decades ago. Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, even though this is Cuba, this is basically occupied territory of the United States. Cuban government was never able to take this naval base, and this is sort of well known because of where we house terrorists and other individuals that we find on the battlefield and aren't quite sure what to do with them in terms of prosecution. As I mentioned to you, the island of Hispaniola, the only island that has two countries on it. The Dominican Republic, sort of well known for its baseball players, as well as, again, its tourism. Because it's a larger island like Cuba, it also has a pretty stable agricultural economy. Tobacco is grown a lot in Dominican Republic, the same thing with Cuba, as well as sugar, bananas, other tropical agricultural products. Haiti, on the other hand, is a densely populated country, but is incredibly poor. There is not a lot of economic development. Farming is very difficult there because it is, as you can see, more mountainous than much of Dominican Republic. Haiti used to be highly forested. All the trees, for the most part, have been cut down, and so it relies mostly on the local economy to carry it. There isn't a lot of international investment there, although there is a desire to try to build Port-au-Prince into a manufacturing hub, particularly things like textiles, the way that other countries like Honduras and Mexico and so forth have become that for the United States. Puerto Rico, another interesting country. All these countries are in what's called the Greater Antilles, the larger Caribbean islands. Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States, so it is people that live in Puerto Rico are American citizens, but they don't enjoy all the same rights as mainland Americans. The economy here is primarily industrial. It thrives on its connections to the United States. Much of the island is mountainous. There's a huge mountain range that runs right through the middle of it, and then the rest of it is tropical. San Juan is one of the largest cities in all of the Caribbean. So this is Middle America. If you have any questions about these particular countries, certainly let me know. There will be another slide presentation that will focus on South America, which you'll find posted on the web. Thanks so much.